You're listening to WLPN 105.5 FM Chicago, and you're listening to Labor Express Radio, Chicago's only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. News for people by working people. I'm your host, Jeremy Lucero, and this is the Sunday, April 22nd, 2018 edition of Labor Express. April 6th through the 8th, Chicago hosted the 2018 Labor Notes Conference. Labor Notes is a media and organizing project and a network of rank-and-file union members, local union leaders, and labor activists that's been fighting to put the movement back in the labor movement since 1979. The Labor Notes Conference, held every 2 years, is the premier event for labor movement activists from around the country to come together, learn from each other, and strategize for the future of our movement. Unfortunately, unlike at previous Labor Notes conferences, our ability to cover the conference was severely limited due to unfortunate, unforeseen circumstances, some of which will be made clear later in the program. However, Labor Express radio reporter Dale Lehman was able to attend some of the conference, and on tonight's program I'll air some of the audio that he collected for us. We will also have in the program audio from a recent protest in Chicago by railroad workers against unsafe working conditions on the railroads, and some very sad news about Labor Beat TV co-founder and chief producer Larry Duncan. But first, we have our new international labor news update from our friends at Labor Radio based in Canada. This edition of Solidarity News looks at education workers' global organizing to make primary and secondary education free for all, and global unions' protests over the arrest of the former Brazilian president, union leader, and current presidential campaign frontrunner, Lula da Silva.
This is Solidarity News on Radio Labor.
This is a Radio Labor special report recorded on April 18th, 2018. I'm Mark Boulanger. The largest global union in the world, Education International, has chosen a new general secretary. David Edwards will now lead the organization, which represents some 32 million teachers and other education workers in 132 countries. He succeeds Fred Van Leeuwen, the founding General Secretary of EI. I talked to Mr. Edwards about the challenges facing EI as he takes office. Specifically, I asked him about the implementation of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. One of the SDGs, as they are known, is a goal about ensuring inclusive and quality education for all.
Well, Mark, inside of that goal, which is Goal 4 of Sustainable Development Goals, there are a number of targets. There are actually 7 targets. And the first target, in addition to inclusive and quality education, is free inclusive and quality education all the way through secondary, which is actually a very big change in terms of what the United Nations goals have been. One of the areas that EI is working on quite closely has to do with the measuring of across all the targets and the indicators that are being measured, because those are quite, how shall we say, contestable. Governments would like to have very easy targets that they can sort of easily check off and say that they're meeting them, whether education is free, whether girls and boys have reached gender parity, whether teachers are qualified, whether they're being paid or remunerated adequately. All those kinds of things are in there. And so one of the things that we've done is we've developed a toolkit to monitor and track how those targets are actually being achieved by governments. And we're working with our members who are actually the eyes and ears on the ground in the schools, who are holding governments to account through sort of what we call a teacher union accountability process, so that we can actually hold them to account. But there is a major issue with the Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 4 in that there is no financing target at all. So basically, this whole thing has been costed out, and there has been absolutely no attempts to try to make sure that the resource of the domestic financing, the Global Partnership for Education, is going to have enough resources to actually make it real. One of the challenges has to do with how do we actually close the financing gap in a sustainable way. We know that aid only makes up about 1% of what is actually needed, and that the rest of it actually has to come through taxation and other revenue streams that are domestic. So we have to make sure that happens. The other area that we have to really put a lot of pressure on is what we call the sort of the political will gap. And that's the fact that a lot of governments have sort of signed up to these, but they don't even know what they signed up to, or when they talk about the goals, they talk about it in a way that sort of fits better with what they're trying to do. So they might not say free quality education for primary and secondary. They might say affordable. And that's particularly problematic in countries that have proclivity to outsource education to for-profit private providers. And that's where we have to really put a lot of pressure to make sure that both in terms of the financing, in terms of the political will, that the social accountability is in place.
You mentioned that some educational organizations are attracted to defined targets. One of these is outcome-based education, or OBE as it's known. What is outcome-based education, and what is EI's position on it?
Outcome-based education is sort of what economists think about when they think about education. So outcomes, it's what's easy to measure is what they like, standardized test scores. Because in their sort of conceptualization of what education is that there's this sort of finite amount of knowledge that needs to be delivered, and what teachers do is deliver it to students, and then students sort of regurgitate that knowledge, and it can be measured through these tests.
We stand with Lula.
We stand with Lula. That is the rallying cry spreading through the international labor movement in support of Brazil's former president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Lula, as he is known, was imprisoned last Saturday, April 7th, after a 2-day standoff that saw him take refuge in the Metal Workers Union headquarters in Sao Paulo. Support for Lula was organized by CUT, Brazil's largest labor federation. The building is where Lula began his career as a trade unionist. Thousands set up a human shield around the building in an attempt to stop the police from arresting him. Lula addressed his supporters saying he would leave the metal workers building and surrender himself to the authorities. He said, "No, I am not hiding. I am going to prison to see their faces so they know I am not afraid. So they know that I am not going to run away. And so they know I am going to prove my innocence. They need to know that." In a judicial process many have declared unfair, Lula was found guilty last year of accepting bribes from construction companies. He has always denied the allegations. After surrendering to police, the 72-year-old was taken to prison to start serving a 12-year sentence for corruption. Lula was Brazil's president from 2003 to 2011. Because of term limits, he was not eligible to run for a third consecutive term. Just recently, once again eligible, he has been running for president and was high in the polls for the October election. His jailing is seen as an attempt by the country's right wing to stop him from ever becoming president again. One of the labor leaders urging support for Lula is Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. The ITUC is the global body which represents national labor centers such as the Ghana Trades Union Congress.
What's happened in Brazil is a travesty of justice. It's the breakdown of law and order and a fundamental attack on democracy. When you look at the influence of the media determined to jail an innocent man in order to stop him running for president, this is simply wrong. The trade union movement, our members around the world stand with you, Lula, with the CUT, with the unions in Brazil, with civil society, for justice, for an end to this travesty, for the right for democratic process. We will globalise this protest. We stand with Lula.
Ms. Burrow's call for support for Lula has been echoed by the global unions. David Edwards, the General Secretary of Education International, urged Brazil to respect democracy and denounced the long-standing campaign of political harassment and the glaring lack of evidence. Rosa Pavanelli, General Secretary of Public Services International, said, "The imprisonment of Lula at this precise moment serves an agenda that goes against all the social achievements that Brazil has reached in recent years. An election without Lula," she said, "would be a fraud." The General Secretary of the International Transport Workers Federation, Stephen Cotton, told the media that the ITF stands in absolute solidarity with their Brazilian comrades against this injustice and flagrant disregard for due democratic and legal process. Global Union General Secretary Philip Jennings said, Lula's imprisonment is a travesty of justice, and we call for him to be set free. Referring to an earlier gunfire attack on Lula's campaign bus, the General Secretary of Industrial, Walter Sanchez, said, we call on the Brazilian authorities to investigate and punish the perpetrators of these criminal attacks, and to ensure normalcy and peace in the exercise of the political process so that Brazil can resume a democratic coexistence. And that's it. International labor news you can use. Radio Labor's newscasts are available on its website, Facebook, iTunes, union websites, and community radio stations. Follow us on Twitter @Radio Labor. I'm Mark Belanger. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's all about global solidarity.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio News for people by working people, and that was our weekly International Labor News update from Solidarity News, produced by Radio Labor in Canada. For more on Radio Labor, see their website at radiolabor.net. Before we move on into coverage of the 2018 Labor Notes Conference, I do have some extremely sad news to report to our listeners. Regular listeners to Labor Express Radio are aware that Labor Express has a sister TV program called Labor Beat TV on cable access television here in Chicago. The co-founder and chief producer of Labor Beat TV, as well as the Committee for Labor Access, which oversees this radio program as well, Larry Duncan, passed away last week. It's a difficult time for those of us who were close to Larry. This show would not be on the air today if it was not for Larry's mentoring and support as I took over the radio program back in 2004 from the original host, Wayne Heimbach. And many times over the past 14 years, when I felt ready to give up the program, it was Larry's support that kept me going. Larry was planning to record video and audio for Labor Beat and Labor Express at the 2018 Labor Notes Conference just before his tragic passing. I knew Larry since our days working together on the State Worker Solidarity Committee way back in the early 90s. Larry founded Labor Beat back in the mid-1980s and was a labor activist for a long time before that. His passing is an unbelievable loss to the Chicago labor movement and especially to labor media. Honestly, it's hard to imagine Labor Beat, Labor Express, and the Committee for Labor Access without the many hours of work each week that Larry committed himself to keep us all afloat. But I and the others that are involved in the TV and the radio programs are committed to keeping Larry's legacy alive. There's an official notice of Larry's passing posted on both the Labor Express and Labor Beat Facebook pages. It was put together by Andrew Friend or Labor Beat TV with some help from myself and others. I encourage you to read that, what's posted there. It'll give you a little more information about Larry's passing as well as what a important and wonderful man he was. So definitely check that out. Sometime in the next few months, there will be a public celebration of Larry's life open to the public. I will provide details on the program here as they become available. I'll post them up on the Facebook page as well. And I will have an episode of Labor Express Radio devoted to remembering Larry in the coming weeks, so definitely tune in the future for that. But for now, the best I can do is I can air one of the very last pieces that Larry produced for Labor Beat TV. On March 12th, as the railroad industry corporate executives held a conference at the Union League Club of Chicago, railroad workers held a protest outside on the sidewalk. They were trying to alert the public to the alarming statistics on railroad safety in terms of the deaths of railroad workers, as well as the safety of the communities which the railroads go through. Larry recorded video of the event and produced one of Larry Beat's most recent videos entitled Railroad Workers Protest Over Safety at Executives Conference. It's a classic example of Larry's commitment to covering workers' struggles. And Larry, interesting enough, was always very fond of railroad workers' stories in particular. So I think this is a good way to remember him at the moment. So here's some audio excerpts from that recent Larry Beat TV video.
So we're out today picketing in front of the Union League Club of Chicago. This is where high-powered railroad executives from the Class 1 freight railroads in the United States and Canada are meeting to discuss business development. In other words, they're trying to figure out ways to make more money off of the backs of their workers. We're here today talking about the impact of this kind of greed on the workers themselves, as well as the inability of the railroad to adequately invest in infrastructure and safe staffing levels.
What's happening is the Railway Age Rail Development Conference, and it's a gathering of rail CEOs, executives, vice presidents, everybody from the transportation industry out to port industry, and they're having like a development conference, and we're down here to let them know we don't agree with their policies.
Stop corporate greed! Stop corporate greed! Stop corporate greed! Stop corporate greed!
The theme of today is greed. The railroads in this country are exhibiting unrighteous greed, and it's coming at a cost of two main groups. One is those of us that work on the railroad. The railroads in negotiations with our unions have demanded crazy concessions on our health care and have only been willing to give a pittance of wage increases.
Brian Smith with the International Brother of the Teamsters. Been working on the railroads for the past year. Been knocking down some big wins for the guys. They complaining about their working conditions, their health care, their safety, and just trying to win these campaigns and bring up the standard for the rail industry, get it back to where it needs to be. I think they had 1983 pay rates. That's ridiculous. So, plus we going at the XPO, so we know they touch all XPO freight. Just trying to get the rail industry back.
So the second group that the railroad is putting at risk is the community. By cutting costs, by refusing to have safe staffing levels, the railroads of this country are putting the communities through which the railroads run at risk. And this is our primary message today.
We know right now more than ever, workers are not getting the deal that we deserve, that we work too hard and too long for too little money and far too few benefits.
Absolutely.
And so what you all are doing here is important. It's great that we're out here, that folks are seeing you. And the example you're setting for your families, for all workers, is just amazing, exactly what we need. So we are here to support you. We've got your back. Whatever you need, let us know.
Chicago is the center of all rail in the United States. It's a major hub. This city right now is not safe because of the railroads. We have a looming crisis that is going to result in massive bloodshed if something is not done. A couple of numbers. In the year 2017, a relatively good year in this count, there were 1,190 derailments in the 48 lower states of the United States of America. 1,190. That's more than 3 a day. And that does not include derailments inside rail yards, derailments related to crossings. That's one. Number two, there were 888 deaths on the railroad in 2017. 888. Now, roughly 500 of those were suicides, and we can't entirely hold the railroad accountable to that, although they could have been doing better. We know that. That leaves over 300 deaths on the railroad in 2017 not related to suicides. That is outrageous. And there is no reason to believe that it's going to get any better if railroads like CSX, for instance, continue to cut and cut and cut. And so CSX just last week announced over 6,000 job cuts by 2020. We obviously hope that doesn't happen, because what is already an unsafe railroad will become unsafer, specifically for the people of Chicago.
One of the things today is about safety, and we just got the word. One of our brothers, Quentin Paisley, he's a track worker on CSX, just lost his life. All these guys are in here partying it up while he's dead. You know, that's to me. We'd like to have a moment of silence.
protest and the picket line that's happening today is a true show of solidarity. And the meeting here at the Union League Club in Chicago is an example of that, where they're inside, just like ALEC was in 2014, where they're considering their profit margins while they failed to make sure that not one single worker dies on the job for 2018. So they're on the path of repeating the same situation where many workers' lives are at risk. In addition to that, they're supposed to be health and safety standards that the railroads are supposed to follow, and they are woefully behind in that. And that's what has cost 888 railway workers' lives, and that's a travesty. So apparently these railway companies, CSX and others, are more concerned about profit over literally the 888 lives of those members that were lost.
What's been happening on the freight railroads in recent years is staff numbers have been cut very dangerously across all occupations on the railroad, which has led to serious safety concerns for communities like Chicago, which are big rail hub towns. Chicago being the #1 rail hub town in this country. So here we are in downtown Chicago, alerting the folks walking down the street, as well as the railroad executives whose greed we think is very damaging to both the community and the workforce, that we're not taking this anymore. We are going to be raising the heat on them with the demand that they reinvest in people, they reinvest in infrastructure, and they rebuild the safety of America's railroad.
That full video that audio was excerpted from is available on the Labor Express Radio Facebook page. You can find more of the video as well as identify the people who spoke there by going to that video. And again, for more on the passing of Labor TV producer Larry Duncan, which I can't tell you how difficult this is for me and for all of us involved in Labor Express and Labor Beat, as well as the labor movement here in Chicago. But if you want more, check out our Facebook page. There is a post up there that will give you more information. And again, keep coming back to the program. I will give you more information as it comes available about the memorial services, and I will have a program here that remembers Larry in the next coming weeks. You're listening to Labor Express Radio, which calls only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. April 6th to the 8th, Labor Notes held their 2018 conference here in Chicago. The Labor Notes conference, held every 2 years, is the most important gathering spot for union militants and labor activists from around the country. We were limited in our ability to cover the conference as fully as we have in the past, given my relocation to Southern California and then Larry Duncan's unfortunate passing. However, Labor Express Radio reporter Dale Lehman was able to attend part of the conference and captured some of the spirit of what went on this year. Unsurprisingly, teachers and their unions were at the forefront of this year's conference. The panel of West Virginia teachers discussing their recent historic statewide strike victory in one of the country's most politically regressive states was one of the most well-attended and exciting panels at the conference. Dale spoke with one of the West Virginia teachers who helped organize the strike after the panel had concluded. Jay O'Neill is a 7th grade English teacher, and he emphasized how the teachers are continuing their struggle and are looking to transform the political, social, and economic status quo in their state.
For us, our health care was the thing that sent us out. And while we got a promise from the governor of a task force, and he froze it at the current level so these proposed changes aren't going into effect, it's still not solved, it's not fixed. And so that's our organizing issue right now that we're really trying to work around is the health insurance. For us, it covers all public employees in the entire state. So that's like 1 out of every 9 West Virginians. So it's a big, broad issue, and we're going to focus on that and getting that fixed. What we're really trying to do is focus on the methods of funding this insurance. So we're trying to do really progressive methods of taxation. So one thing that came out of the strike, a lot of people talked about, why are we not raising our severance tax on natural gas? West Virginia has huge reserves of natural gas. Severance tax is way too low. Why are we not raising that and raising hundreds of $millions a year to help pay for this? I mean, it's going to be paid like 90% of it by out-of-state corporations, right? Why are we not raising the corporate net income tax, which is what they lowered 10 years ago to said we'd bring in more jobs. We have fewer jobs now than we did then. So another one that's paid by out-of-state corporations. So we're trying to push that method, that we're not asking regular West Virginians to help pay for our health care. We want out-of-state corporations to pay for it because they're the ones that have stolen the wealth out of our state for the past 100 years. It was the coal companies at first, now it's the natural gas companies. We're tired of being this extraction colony for the rest of the country and the rest of the world. It's time for them to pay their fair share. And I think that message is resonating with your average West Virginian who maybe is not a public employee, just has a regular job. They can get behind that because they know our state's been exploited,
Do you think there's greater awareness at the class-based nature?
I do, actually, and that's kind of the thing. In a weird way, that's what's kind of, I think, turned West Virginia off of the Democratic Party recently, because there's been a lot of focus kind of on identity politics and things like that. And in a place like West Virginia, I mean, it's 93% white. But beyond that, even, class is the biggest issue. People are suffering. People are destitute. It's a very high poverty state, and no one's talking about the real issues. So that's what we want to talk about and bring to the forefront and keep that out in front rather than worrying about politician, XYZ.
Or what somebody's preference is in their identity.
Exactly. That's not important. For this. What's important for this is class-based issues, funding for public schools, funding for health care, and stop getting ripped off by these huge corporations that are sucking the wealth out of our state.
And what do the kids see as their future?
If you ask them, are you planning on staying in West Virginia? Almost all of them say, no, I'm getting out of here. It feels that hopeless. We're hoping now with the strike and something positive finally happening in our state that we can kind of change that. But until very recently, kids just want to get out. I mean, there's a huge opioid crisis. There's just a lot of poverty. There's no jobs. I mean, as you can see, even going into teaching, that pays terribly. We're shedding teachers. I'll just tell you mine. I'm in my 7th year teaching. I've got a master's degree plus 15 credits, on the salary scale. I make $42,000 a year. Before tax. That's, gross.
We need to take a station ID break, but when we return, we'll have more audio from the 2018 Labor Notes Conference. You're listening to Labor Express Radio News for people by working people and our coverage of the 2018 Labor Notes Conference. Dale also spoke with other teachers who had attended the panel, including a teacher from Arizona, which might be the next place to see a statewide teachers strike. These teachers emphasized how this new teachers movement is very much a grassroots, bottom-up, rank-and-file challenge to their own union bureaucracies in many cases.
Dylan Wigella. I'm a social studies teacher, 7th grade, at Mark D. Atkinson Middle School in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm one of the lead organizers for Arizona Educators United. My specific job in our organization is to coordinate with our school leaders or liaisons and help them organize their sites and get people to the actions that we call.
It's a new organization?
Yeah, we started about a month ago. I think there's a lot of things that are going on. I think most importantly, the inaction of their response to our demands. For example, our governor said that, Arizona is 43rd in teacher pay, not 50th, which is kind of hilarious for him to say that. And I think he's not using adjusted for cost of living numbers anyway, but still, the fact is that if he's okay with us being 43rd, I think there's a problem in that in general. So the legislature hasn't really moved in the direction that we want them to yet, and I think what that means is we're going to just continue to escalate our actions until they start caving into some of our demands.
And the fact that you moved into action, self-organized, outside of union leadership, or
so it all began outside of union leadership, and we are now working pretty parallel with the Arizona Education Association, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page, because they do have some power as well, and we're all working in solidarity. In solidarity to a united goal.
And it was the West Virginia teachers strike that helped spark your move, or it was?
So it's a really interesting story. There was a group created on Facebook called Arizona Teachers United, and I was added into that group on the bottom level. And what I started doing is I just started adding everyone I could. And Rebecca, who was with me, is the one who created that group. And she was like, whoa, this isn't what I wanted. So she ended up shutting down that group. And Rebecca, me, and some other people created Arizona Educators United, and then it just took off from there. West Virginia definitely made me start thinking about it, but seeing on Facebook what Oklahoma was doing with their group, and I joined their group, and I saw, time for a walkout, and there was a date, and there was 40,000 people in there. I was like, wow, this is powerful. We could just create a Facebook group here and see what happens. And all of a sudden, we had, I think, 20,000 at the end of a week, and now we're up to 42,000, I think.
Yeah, my name's Justin Vinson. I'm a teacher in Seattle, part of Social Equity Educators, which is a caucus within the Seattle Education Association. And we're just out here taking notes from all of the inspiring stories from West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona, because we want to know, teachers in Washington State want to know what we can do to follow their lead. We've had a successful strike 3 years ago, and we want in Seattle. We want to build on that. We're trying to find out ways that we can spread it across the entire state of Washington, not just Seattle. How you have these conversations every day and just kind of talk out into the ether, but when you have concrete examples like this, it makes that conversation much more palpable, and students start to gain a sense of, there is something I can do. I think everyone senses the powerlessness and the frustration and the anger and the injustice that pervades the system, but it's harder to kind of point to examples or to feel concrete examples of the power that people hold when they organize collectively and point in the same direction.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio News for people by working people in our coverage of the 2018 Labor Notes Conference. Of course, teachers and their struggles were not the only sector of workers represented at Labor Notes. The conference always includes workers in every imaginable occupation coast to coast. Dale spoke with a longshoreman from Florida who spoke about his concerns regarding automation, another important theme at the conference. The longshore unions have long been some of the most impacted by the increasing use of robots. The ILWU on the West Coast was forward-thinking in this regard, and their long history of labor militancy won the longshoremen tremendous wages and benefits in exchange for the workers accepting and in some ways embracing the replacement of the very dangerous, grueling physical aspects of the job by machines. But automation now threatens to reduce the already highly diminished number of workers in the ports. It's a reality facing workers in production economy-wide. Increasingly, automation is threatening to replace what blue-collar labor remains in this country, and in an economy in which income remains tied to work, it's a real crisis brewing for the entire working class. This is a topic that we will delve into more in upcoming episodes.
Andre Davis, rank and file member, Local 1402, Tampa, Florida. Management in our industry feels that they can take cranes and automate them where they run by themselves or by a computer, which will diminish jobs for the actual people, the citizens. And as we know, we have politicians running on the sole idea of bringing jobs back from other countries to our country, but letting companies come in and say they want to use automation, which the jobs that they are bringing in will just be taken by robots. Long time ago, longshore work was very vigorous and hard. The men couldn't even hardly sit up to eat once they got home after long hours. Some didn't come home for days and weeks. At first, in the beginning, it would be human lines, human beings in lines, and they would shift bag from bag to person onto a pallet or onto a sling. They would even go from the ship to the grounds when discharging the cargo. So a lot of these things was really vigorous work, back-breaking work. The people that really got down and dirty with the work has right now into 20th century have been able to reap the benefits of good health benefits. Thanks to unions, good health benefits, good salaries, and good insurance and stuff like that, enough to grow their families and provide for their families and their children, and even bring generations behind them into this industry. And thanks to unions, we are able to provide for our families right now. And as is right now, we still use a lot of manpower, even with containerization. But what the conversation is about the automation that the management, the status quo smart guys think that'll be better for them.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio, which calls only English language labor news and current affairs radio program. Two of the greatest strengths of every Labor Notes conference is the bringing together of worker activists not only from around the country but from around the world, and their ability to share innovative strategies and experiences. One example from this year's conference was George Floresco, a Canadian postal worker who spoke on a panel called Labor Organizing Against Climate Change. Floresco discussed the Canadian Postal Workers Union's program addressing climate change entitled Delivering Community Power. It is an effort by postal workers to compel the Canadian Post Office to use its vast resources and established networks to advance a green economy and energy efficiency.
I just want to talk a little bit about delivering community power. Delivering community power is something that the postal workers, in conjunction with some other groups in Canada, started talking about as a way to reimagine what it would be to transition a major piece of publicly owned infrastructure to kickstart the transition to a green economy and to a green future for, I guess, Canadians in that regard. But it does more than that as well, and I won't get into too much, but it's about reimagining just the postal service overall. The basic idea of delivering community power is that we can use the infrastructure that we have because we already own the post office. We're in every community. We have 6,300 post offices across the country to kickstart that transition. And so it goes into a few different avenues that I'll touch on. So the first thing that we want with regards to delivering community power is we have the largest fleet in Canada, largest vehicle fleet, thousands of them. They're all running on diesel or gasoline, and we believe that Canada Post, through its procurement policies, can purchase electric vehicles to start that change. We believe that we can use the infrastructure of the actual physical locations of the post office to put charging stations in communities that don't have them, so that the network that exists currently, which is sorely lacking outside of urban centers, can be a situation where we fill in the gaps and people don't have what is commonly referred to as range anxiety when they're driving an electric vehicle, one of the biggest things that stops people from purchasing an electric vehicle. We talk about utilizing postal banking, something that the American postal workers, I think there's a couple of them in the room today, know about as well, and using those locations, because the banks who in Canada, there's 6 banks that pull in about $40 billion of profit a year. That's with a B, 40 billion. That's a lot of money. They're flying away from rural communities, and in urban communities, Indigenous folks and low-income folks are increasingly relying on payday lenders to get their funds, and are being preyed upon by these groups. Oftentimes, banks have shares within these payday lender companies as well, so it's just kind of a cycle. So postal banking can act as an opportunity to use that infrastructure, go into the communities, offer those banking services to the underserved, and to use the money from those banks to fund green initiatives within communities. And those are some of the things that we were thinking about when we wanted to launch the document, and it came out of a discussion with a group in Canada. There's a group of community activists, environmental activists, labor activists, of which my union was part of, that launched something that is overall good. It's called the LEAP Manifesto. The LEAP Manifesto is an attempt at building a larger tent that says we can't just take baby steps anymore. We need to leap. Hence the name. And so we helped write that document with a number of other people. But the criticism of the LEAP Manifesto was that it was such a big idea. How are we going to actually put into practice the ideas that they're talking about? And Delivering Community Power was the first attempt at looking at what policy proposals could we put into place that deal with some of the problems that we're seeing. So we decided to start rolling it out and talking to every community organization, every labor union we could, every environmental group, and quickly we started having endorser after endorser after endorser, and we currently have about 70 different labor, community, and NGO organizations endorsing it, which we're pretty happy about. We also have municipalities, hundreds of municipalities across the country endorsing the program as well. So even still though, part of the problem with the Delivering Community Power document, and it's not a problem, it's a vision document, is that it still doesn't get down to the brass tacks of how you get it done. It talks about potential proposals, but what does that look like in practice? So over the last year and a half, the last year and a half, postal workers have been trying to shift away from vision to reality. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the things that we've been doing, and the kind of trajectory that we're taking to try and make it happen. So the first thing that we did, and this is something small that most organizations should do anyways, and I don't think that this is the game changer, is that we said, okay, if we're going to talk about all of this, we're going to do an environmental audit of our own organization. We're going to take a look at what we're doing as an organization and the impacts that it's having on the environment. We have a challenge to reduce just under 1,000 tons of carbon as an organization. About half of that comes from air travel, and so we've started to take steps to make sure, because we're a large country, obviously, from coast to coast to coast, that we're going to take steps to reduce that by hopefully around 50%, if not more, over the coming years, to tackle some of that. Where the vehicles that we purchase are in future going to be hybrid or hybrid electric or full electric vehicles, and in all of our facilities that we own, we're looking at energy-saving retrofits as well as programs that we can implement to reduce our footprint. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're a small union. We're 50,000 people, which is, for a national union, not that large. And we are not going to be the ones that change capitalism just like that. We said, okay, well, what else can we do? And one of the things that we had been doing, but that we are now pushing again, is started talking through a mechanism that we have in our collective agreement, which is a special projects mechanism, to the corporation, because our post office is publicly owned, but it's run like a corporation. And we've started talking to them, saying, we're going to be doing all of these initiatives, and our strategy has been consistent. We tell them, we're going to do this. We'll invite you to do it with us. If you don't, we're going to go ahead and do it anyways. And to be honest with you, they haven't come around. So they look like a boss because they're a boss and they don't really give a But, we need to show that by leading in that regard, right? So one of the things that we've done is in Atlantic Canada, for folks that I guess know the east coast of America, if you're American, like Maine, for instance, just above Maine, we've got New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. It's not a very populous or a part of the country. It's quite rural. What we did is we held focus groups with communities across each of those provinces to talk about charging stations. And we've now mapped out each of those provinces, where charging stations exist, where they don't exist, where post offices exist, how they overlap. And we're going to be making proposals on how we can use post offices as a fill-in-the-gap measure to putting level 3 charging stations in there to fill in those gaps and help reduce that range anxiety. it's been extremely successful in terms of building community support, and it has the added benefit of saying we don't have to redouble our infrastructure. So one of the other things that we've done is we've decided we're at a negotiations table for the majority of our members, and we've decided to put climate change on the bargaining table. So we have two major demands, and we go to our membership for the demands, and then they come back, and then we put what they've said to us back to them to vote on. So they voted in favor of these demands overwhelmingly. One of them is a service expansion into all different ranges, so postal banking, digital access, things like that, creating space. And the other one is greening of the post office. So through those demands, we have a couple of things that we are focusing on. One is the fleet. We have a number of requests for tenders that Canada Post is putting forward for new fleets for all of our routes. And we are at the table trying to force them to switch over to electric vehicles on a rollout basis. Obviously, you can't do it all at once. We have a lot of vehicles. And then one of the other two things that I'll say that we're talking about is doing energy retrofits at these old buildings, because one of the other major ways that we use energy is heat loss in old buildings. It's horribly inefficient. So we're saying that we have the ability to, and we should be doing energy retrofits. And the third thing that we're doing that at the bargaining table that kind of helps with this is that they won't just do it, because they're talking about, maybe we can get the workers to turn off the lights when they leave. That's literally something that's been said, right? So we need some sort of enforcement mechanism. So what we're doing is we're putting forward a proposal for what we're calling joint environmental committees. So much like a joint health and safety committee, stuff that works at the local, regional, and national levels, where they have to sit at the table, and at the local levels, there's targets that we would set, and then at that location-based system, or at a certain location, they would have to meet and come up with ways to reduce the greenhouse gases at that target or at that place. So we're currently in bargaining. We don't know what's going to happen with this, but we will say that the community support's been incredible, and it's going to be really easy for us, if they don't want to do this, to get in front of the media and say, they're being jerks. That's absolutely right. That we're fighting for the future of not just our jobs, but the planet, and Canada Post doesn't want to do it. So that's some of the stuff we're doing. Sorry I took so much of your time.
You're listening to Labor Express Radio, which calls only English language labor news and current affairs radio program, and our coverage of the 2018 Labor Notes Conference. As I mentioned previously, the international aspect of Labor Notes conferences is always one of the highlights. Dale spoke with journalist Stefan Kimberly from the German left-wing daily newspaper Young Welt. What is particularly interesting in his comments is how worker activists right now around the world are looking at the U.S. both with great fear and concern, but also to find inspiration for their own struggles.
I think you've got two trends at the moment internationally. On the one side, I think a lot of workers internationally are scared about what Trump represents, the dangers of new wars, of protectionism, of nationalism, but obviously also you've got these tendencies, shift to the right in Europe is right-wing populism, but also you mentioned France with Macron government attacking the workers. You've got a challenge that on top of neoliberalism and all its attacks, you've got now the dangers of nationalism, protectionism, playing workers against workers. And at the same time, the irony is that a lot of people are looking to the US now, I think more activists in Europe, and they see...
The people or the government?
I would say a lot of activists within the movements, they look to the US and they see Bernie Sanders. They see suddenly socialism as a point of interest in the United States. There is suddenly an upsurge of socialist activism with the DSA, and now you have got it looks like an uncontrollable teachers movement where people, they took away all rights of people in West Virginia, in Kentucky, right to work states, and then workers, teachers, they take the initiative, they fight back, they look for what they need, and they overcome all these legal barriers. I think that's inspiring. You mentioned, as I said, France, and there the workers under huge pressures, under attack, they fight back, led by the railway workers, taking with them a lot of public sector workers. I think that's also an element in West Virginia, that you had the teachers, but then it was all educators, everyone in the schools, and then beyond that, the public sector workers acting and fighting in sympathy. I think these two trends are there, and at least I think the threat of this new nationalism, of continued neoliberal attacks, and then on top of that, these right-wing attacks, that's driving people in a lot of fear, but also in anger, and anger as a basis for new struggles.
Okay. Tell me, what is neoliberalism in your mind?
I think after the crisis in the 70s, there was a deep crisis of profitability, of a way to accumulate more capital. And the answer that the capitalists were able to force on us was smashing union power, driving down wages, increasing the exploitation during the workday. This went ahead with a new surge of free trade agreements, globalization, meaning being able to move capital around the globe in the search for the best profits, but again, putting workers against workers. A huge financialization of capitalism, where these global capital markets became increasingly dominant and created their own bubbles. But there was a qualitative shift, I think. And also the search for profits globally, but then within the states, there's privatizations, another source of generating profits on the backs of workers and on the workers working in the public sector, but also the people just depending on public services, just driving those down. I think that was neoliberalism, and with the crisis in 2007, 2008, there is a crisis of this whole model, but they got everything. They ruined our wages, or they drove down our living conditions, and then they can't blame anybody else. This system, this capitalist system, and getting everything led to the Great Recession, the biggest crisis in 80 years. And I think we're still in a situation where everyone knows that there is no viable way forward.
Not with this system.
There's still an ongoing crisis. Yes, you had a certain recovery, but the whole promise of the American dream is empty. People know it. But that's where the interesting development is, that at least you've got a restart of a discussion about an alternative, a discussion about socialism. And I think there's no agreement what this would mean. But that's where I would think there's an openness to talk about how can we use the wealth that is there in this most powerful capitalist nation on earth, with the top 1% getting richer and richer. How can we fundamentally change things? And that's where I would think a discussion needs to start. But we need a really completely new model of organizing that starts with labor, but it also goes on a political plane. We need a new mass party of working class people. And to democratically come together, discuss. I think such a party should have a socialist program to transform society. That's, I think, what's on stake, and that's what I think my impression is a lot of people are looking for. How can we get organized on all levels, democratically from below, but with a program that helps us to challenge the power of big business running through every aspect of this society.
That's all for tonight's program. Of course, you can always find out more about the issues, organization, and people discussed here on Labor Express by going to our Facebook page, which you find at facebook.laborexpress.org. Again, I really encourage everybody listening to check it out, this time in particular, because of the information we've posted up there about the passing of Larry Duncan. And again, this is a very difficult time for all of us, and I really encourage you to check that out. Maybe post your own feedback and comments on there as well. Also, I'm experimenting with a Labor Express Radio YouTube page, and I'm looking for listener feedback on that. It takes a tremendous amount of effort to get this program out every week, and to add more parts to it, like adding a YouTube page is extra work. So I do want to get feedback from listeners and see if that's something worth continuing to do. So you can check that out also through the Facebook page, which again is facebook.laborexpress.org. Labor Express is a nonprofit 501c3 member of IBEW Local 1220. The views expressed on Labor Express are those of its producer and those of the IBEW. Labor Express is a production of the Community for Labor Express in Chicago, the world capital of the labor movement. The songs, our theme is called Worker Songs, written by Ed Pickford and recorded by the Dropkick Murphys. Tune in next Sunday at 8 p.m. for another edition of Labor Express.